Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, is still Latin America the U.S. backyard? Our guest, Alex Main, Director of International Policy at CIPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Alex Main, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Jorge.
Alex, recently at the UN General Assembly, President Trump was mentioning the Monroe Doctrine, quote unquote, America for the Americans, and he made reference to the possible threats of foreign countries. And also recently you were writing an article under the title of Is Still Latin America the US Backyard? Is it?
That was an interesting speech. As always, President Trump has interesting speeches when he's in front of an international audience. And it would have been absolutely shocking that he had said that he had evoked the Monroe Doctrine in positive terms, except that someone in his administration had already done that. The former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, just before setting off on his first big trip around Latin America, he talked about the Monroe Doctrine very positively, policy that should remain in place since the middle of the 19th century, and then it was hardened somewhat by Teddy Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century, and seen rightly as a policy of basically maintaining U.S. Political hegemony throughout the Latin American region. It had become a taboo thing to talk about, and in fact, under President Obama, you had Secretary of State John Kerry who came out and said, you know, the Monroe Doctrine is a thing of the past now. But they're very proud under President Trump to bring it back, and I think at this point no one is really surprised by what President Trump has to say on the international stage. But it does, I think, represent a further hardening of U.S. policy throughout the Western Hemisphere, and a real intent to intervene politically wherever necessary in order to advance U.S. interests throughout the region.
So if you have to say yes or no, is still Latin America the U.S. backyard?
I think the question is one of perspective. I think from the point of view of the U.S. foreign policy elites, Latin America still is very much the U.S. backyard. And as I and others have pointed out, you have many very important and influential foreign policy experts in academics here in the United States that sort of take it for granted that the Latin American region is one where the U.S. should really dominate. It should be their sphere of influence. A bit, as we, of course, saw after the Yalta Agreement after World War II between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, and having various spheres of influence. Well, in, I think, the minds of the U.S. foreign policy elite, this continues. They say so very clearly. Even those that are in favor of withdrawing the U.S. military presence, for instance, in the Middle East and elsewhere, and believe that it's none of the U.S.'s business to be involved, for instance, in Russia's affairs with its neighbors and so on. Even those experts, such as John Mearsheimer, really put a big accent on the importance of maintaining U.S. influence in Latin America, more than anything in order to maintain the U.S.'s credibility as a worldwide superpower.
Certain analysts says that while during the Obama presidency, the foreign policy of the U.S. was, quote unquote, focused in the Middle East, they got a little bit distracted about Latin America, and therefore China and Russia, but especially China, gained terrain, and that could be also, in a way, the response to what President Trump has said. How worried is the U.S. government about the presence of China and Russia in Latin America?
I think they're not very worried about Russia in Latin America. Russia is not a big economic superpower, nor has it been that involved militarily in the region. It has been selling, obviously, weapons and military equipment to certain countries, in particular to Venezuela. But let's remember that there is a U.S. Basically arms embargo against Venezuela that's been in place, since the George W. Bush administration. So really, Venezuela has nowhere else to turn than Russia. But other than that, Russia isn't that involved in the region. I think China is a different issue. China is an economic superpower and is now the #1 trading partner for South America, for instance. China is also making very, very heavy investments throughout Latin America, as it's doing in other parts of the world. But I think it's of greater concern to U.S. foreign policy elites, again, in this region of influence in Latin America, that China is getting as involved. Because obviously with lots of trade, with lots of economic investment, that increases to a certain degree China's influence in the region. And it decreases the U.S. influence. And the U.S. Has had a policy in terms of its economic support, which has often been through multilateral banks like the World Bank, and also through the International Monetary Fund and so on. It has attached conditions to economic support, and those conditions have involved shaping the economic policies within these countries. And this has been very much the case in Latin America, where the U.S. imposed neoliberal policies, in particular starting in the late 70s and in the 80s. And of course, this had really negative economic results in the long term for the region.
We're seeing also a new phenomenon, if you want, that openly they're talking about the possibility of a military intervention in Venezuela.
Well, one would think that this is crazy talk, except that, of course, this is senior leadership in the United States that has been evoking this possibility. President Trump himself has now talked about a military option. It was revealed that he, on several occasions in cabinet meetings, said, why don't we just invade Venezuela to take care of the problem there? And of course, you've had other officials like former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson that have spoken of the possibility of military intervention, as well as the very influential Senator Marco Rubio, who's had a huge influence on President Trump's Latin America policy. He as well has talked about both coups and military intervention. So this makes it a real matter of concern, I think. And it's not impossible that we see a bit of a situation, as we saw, for instance, at the beginning of the Vietnam War. A pretext is created where the U.S. or one of its allies needs to defend itself against Venezuela. I think the most obvious country would be Colombia. And there have been claims of incursions on the part of the Venezuelan National Guard that, of course, been denied by Venezuela. But we see a heightening of tensions where perhaps Colombia and its army, which now has less to do on the home front now that it is in this peace process, will be prepared to get involved in Venezuela. And that's a very frightening prospect indeed, and one that would involve the U.S. almost certainly, as the U.S. is very involved in supporting the Colombian military logistically and in terms of intelligence. There's no doubt that the U.S. would be very involved in any sort of conflict between Venezuela and Colombia.
The last name Cárdenas rings a bell?
So he was a senior diplomat under the George W. Bush administration. He was close to individuals like Roger Noriega and Otto Reich, who sort of represented a very radical hardline on Latin America, and who pursued, while they were in the Bush administration, attempts at regime change in both Cuba and in Venezuela, and were successful in Haiti otherwise. So he is now being considered to be the next Assistant Secretary of State in charge of the Western Hemisphere for the Trump administration. And he is the recent author of an article that encourages a coup d'etat, says that that's something that should be supported in Venezuela to resolve Venezuela's problems. Now, fortunately, this sort of talk and the talk of U.S. military intervention, including from people like the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, has really been received very negatively in the region. In fact, the Rio Group, which consists entirely of right-wing governments that are allies of the United States, actually came out with a strong statement against military intervention. And I think this is the one reason why I think we can have hope that it actually won't occur. But we're dealing today in the United States with an administration that has no qualms about completely unilateral action, even if it goes against what the rest of the world wants. And so, you know, we have reason to still be fearful.
Precisely. If you start to put together everything that you were mentioning, the unilateralism that has been expressed by President Trump at the United Nations, the reference to the Monroe Doctrine, the reference to military intervention, the OAS looks like it's very much in coordinates with the U.S. policy. Is this worrisome for the region?
Well, I think, yes, it absolutely is worrisome. This is, I think, a moment when we're seeing a real backsliding in terms of everything that was accomplished in the last couple of decades in Latin America in terms of increasing the independence of the region and the sovereignty of the countries, the ability of governments to sort of carry out their own policies without as much interference from the United States. That's now a phenomenon that's going in reverse, and certainly the Secretary General of the Organization of American States is accompanying that. But we are beginning to see possibilities of change, a change in the dynamic, particularly with the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, who has always spoken of bringing Mexico back to its traditional policy of non-intervention in the region and respect for the sovereignty of the nations of the region.
What do you think that could be the relationship between the Lima Group and the new government of Mexico when Andrés Manuel López Obrador takes over on December 1st? Something is going to change, and what role the Lima Group has been playing in trying to undermine those progressive governments in Latin America?
Well, the Lima Group has been obsessed with Venezuela. You've had crises and huge problems in other countries. One country that stands out over the period that the Lima Group has existed, and it's existed since August of last year, is Honduras, where you had extremely flawed elections that were followed by very violent repression of protests that led to dozens of deaths. The Lima Group said nothing. Their only focus has been Venezuela, and they've been very much on the side of, I would say, the more hardline sectors of the Venezuelan opposition in wanting the immediate departure of the Venezuelan government. So the only thing they can really accomplish is maintaining this sort of narrative that you see in a lot of the major media, that the Venezuelan government is a pariah sort of regime, and that the only way forward is essentially for it to be toppled. So not a normal sort of electoral process, but a toppling of the government. Hopefully, this is going to change. This dynamic is going to change with Mexico now being in the picture. And the Lima Group perhaps will begin to look a little bit more like a group of friends rather than a group that is entirely hostile to the Venezuelan government. And there was a group of friends in 2002, 2003. The Carter Center was also involved. It involved countries where you had left governments and right-wing governments, and they were much more successful in helping mediate solutions in Venezuela at the time. And I think that's what we need to be thinking of moving forward. There needs to be a dialogue process, but one that involves mediators that are trusted by both sides in Venezuela. I think that's
And what do you think that could be, talking about dialogue, the relationship between the coming president of Mexico, AMLO, as they call him, and President Trump? Because so far it looks like the dialogue has been pretty fluid.
So far, it has looked good. You know, they had an initial phone call, the two of them, after AMLO was elected that was very cordial, where they spoke of issues of mutual interest and advancing together on them. AMLO is not involved in has not been involved in the NAFTA negotiations, the renegotiation of the North America Free Trade Agreement, and that's probably a good thing for AMLO politically, because that wasn't something easy for them to be involved with. And instead they're focusing on migration issues and on security issues, where of course there's a lot of cooperation between both countries. Whether it will work out in the long run is a big question, since we see different positions in each government. In the case of the Trump government, they want to do everything possible to contain the migratory phenomenon, particularly the migration that's coming from Central America today to the United States. And they want Mexico to be very much involved in preventing that migration from occurring. Whereas the Mexican future government, the AMLO himself and members of his team, have been very clear that they want to respect the human rights of these Central American migrants, something which arguably has not been occurring, did not occur under the Peña Nieto government. And so it will be interesting to see how they can sort of reconcile these positions going forward between the U.S. and Mexico. It will be difficult, but I think both sides have a real interest in making it work. Of course, they share a very long border, and it makes sense for them to maintain close cooperation. So we'll have to see what happens, but it's going to be tricky.
López Obrador has invited President Trump to his inauguration on December 1st. He's not going. His Vice President, Mike Pence, is going to be attending the ceremony.
Well, I just think that this is very reminiscent of what we saw under President Obama, particularly towards the end of his administration, where Vice President Joe Biden was the one who essentially took care of relations with Latin America. It shows that for President Trump, just as for President Obama, and before him, President George W. Bush, Latin America is really not much of a priority, and they really prefer to delegate it to other people. The problem is, under President Trump, he's delegated Latin America policy to, I think, some of the worst people possible in terms of trying to maintain good relations with Latin America. And of course, one of those people is Senator Marco Rubio, who has this obsession with Venezuela, an obsession with Cuba, sees the relations with the entire region through that lens. Basically, you're with us or you're against us on either of those countries, and particularly Venezuela. And has come out very strongly saying we will punish small countries like Haiti if they don't vote with us at the Organization of American States on condemning Venezuela and so on. And so I think this is creating, more friction with the region, even despite the fact that you have, very right-wing governments that are dominant in the region today. We can anticipate really further problems going forward with people like Senator Marco Rubio and John Bolton, a neoconservative national security advisor who has also been very, very hostile to the left governments in Latin America. And really, I think these are the sorts of people that believe in a Monroe Doctrine on steroids. And I think Latin America is going to react very badly to that.
Alex Main, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.